Thanks, Rob, and thanks for coming out on such a miserable, drippy evening. I'll attempt not to be miserable or drippy. And we're seeing the Iron Horse tonight in the most beautiful phrase in the English language, in 35 millimeter, the way it was shot. So, thank you, Rob, thank you, Mike, for getting a 35 millimeter print of this magnificent film. The Iron Horse I think of as the film where John Ford began to undertake the responsibility of his huge, huge talent. It was the 36th feature film he made. He'd made 35 features before this. He was 30 years old at the time he went into production on this. So this is a 30-year-old man with 35 features under his belt, which is more features than any director of the modern era could ever hope to complete, given the elongated process of production and the importance of special effects in post-production. You're lucky if you can get 20 or 25 done. But this is a man who completed 35 by the time he was 30 years old. Unlike, to give you some sense of how, what I said, taking the responsibility of his talent, this is a picture Ford went after. He wanted to direct this picture. Now, John Ford never went after anything in his life except a bottle. He never pursued women, particularly. Didn't pursue actors, that was anathema. Actors came and went, he couldn't have cared less, unless it was John Wayne or maybe George O'Brien. People came to him or they didn't, he was completely indifferent to that kind of thing. This picture he went after. The reason William Fox was making the movie in 1924 was the film that Jesse Lasky had made in 1923. Jesse Lasky had produced a picture called The Covered Wagon, directed by James Cruise. It had been a surprise smash hit. Looked at today, it's not spectacular, except for the photography by Carl Brown, but it's good. And it was the beginning of the American, the rebirth, should I say, of the movie's fascination with the Western, after the initial thrill of Bronco Billy in the Nickelodeon era, and William S. Hart slightly later, and Tom Mix. But Hart and Mix were star vehicles. The Covered Wagon didn't live or die by its stars, because it didn't have big stars. It had J. Warren Kerrigan and Lois Wilson. Not big stars then, not big stars now. The picture was the selling point, and so it was with the Iron Horse. Ford hired an extra named George O'Brien, who had made small part pictures before. He'd never carried a picture before. William Fox thought this was a very dicey idea. He wasn't in favor of it, but he'd given the picture to Ford, and he might as well let Ford make the picture and take the responsibility. So Ford hired O'Brien. They became boon companions and pals. For the next 6 or 7 years, O'Brien appeared in a dozen of Ford's pictures over the late silent era, as well as, of course, F.W. Murnau's Sunrise and Michael Curtiz's Noah's Ark. The friendship came to a crashing halt in 1931. The two guys had gone on a boys' adventure around the world cruise. Left there, well, Ford was married, O'Brien wasn't. Ford had basically left his wife to get out of town, because he wanted to get out of town. And O'Brien had gone along. While they were in the Philippines, Ford went on a bender. And a real bender, I mean, that went on for days. And O'Brien twiddled his thumbs for a while, and it was, as you probably all know, at one point or another, having dealt with alcoholics. Alcoholics are very boring. And O'Brien got sick of tending Jack while he was on one of his drunks. So he took off. He continued the trip on his own, which promptly caused Ford to sober up. And Ford held a grudge about O'Brien that continued for the next 17 years, as a matter of fact, until he hired him to do Ford Apache again. These guys had been boon companions, but Ford had felt abandoned in his extreme state by O'Brien. I guess he'd expected O'Brien to be his nursemaid while he went on his bender. But O'Brien had other ideas. But it caused a serious breach between the men that was only healed much later in life. They started production on the Iron Horse with some footage in Mexico for 3 or 4 days. Then they moved up to New Mexico for some more second unit footage, although Ford was shooting it as well. They started the actual production in Nevada. Almost all of the picture was made on location in Nevada, in a little town, outside of a little town called Dodge, Nevada. Now, what they needed in terms of production was obviously a railroad track, because it's about the great uniting of the railroads. The railroad moving east from California, the other railroad moving west from the Midwest, and the two of them meeting at Promontory Point, Utah. In actual fact, the film was shot in Utah. I mean, in Nevada. But they needed the track, and they needed a couple of locomotives. But they also needed a spur, a railroad spur, where the crew could live, the cast and the crew could live. And they found all the equipment they needed outside of Dodge, Nevada. The crew and the cast lived on a train that William Fox rented from the Barnes Circus. So they were living in a circus train, where elephants and lions had been there just weeks before, so the thing smelled to high heaven. They started production in the middle of January 1924. Now, they knew it was going to be chilly. They had no idea just how cold Nevada can be in January. They got off the train, and Ford looked around, and it was snow. There was snow everywhere. And for one of the few times in his life, he froze. He didn't know what to do. They were scheduled for 4 weeks of location work. And there was snow as far as the eye could see, and he turned to George Schneiderman, the cameraman, and said, "I don't know what to do." And Schneiderman said, "We shoot." They had snow when they were building the railroad, didn't they? We'll have snow in the movie. And Ford said, "You're right." And that was the last time Ford didn't grasp the crucial importance of using the weather. For the rest of his career, for the rest of his life, he would insist on taking advantage of whatever crazy stuff nature threw at him when he was on location. If it was a windy day and the air was full of dust, he shot, because the dust made things look alive, and the wind blowing the hats of the cowboys up against their faces made everything look alive. It made it look real. If he was in Monument Valley and there was a lightning storm, he shot. And if the cavalry guys risked getting struck by lightning because of the metal in the horses' bridles, that's their tough luck. It made it look real. That's what he was after. Because he understood that there's a certain romantic falsity at the core of almost any movie, really, if you go right down to it. The 3-act structure, the mostly happy endings. Life's not really like that. But life is full of windstorms. Life is full of lightning and thunder and all these other things. So that was Ford's way of creating a surface reality that would cover up what was often the more conventional dramatics of the movie industry of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. It was one of those movies, the production of which would be, you could make a movie about the making of the movie that would be almost as interesting as the movie itself. Like Apocalypse Now. There are certain movies where they just go through hell and gone, and they come out with a movie, and to everybody's shock and surprise, it's a really good movie. But making it was 50 miles of bad road. For instance, one guy died during the picture. He actually died. He got pneumonia, and they were so far off the beaten track that by the time they realized he was sinking, they couldn't get him to a doctor in time, and he died. Of course, there was no antibiotics in 1924, so it's entirely possible he would have died if they had gotten him to the doctor, but that's no consolation. It's also entirely possible there were some people conceived during the making of the movie. Not that that's that unusual particularly. Often people are conceived during the making of a movie. A brothel set up a couple hundred yards away from the railroad spur where they were all staying. A madam of a whorehouse came and asked either Ford or the production manager if she could set up a tent to service the stuntmen and the actors, whoever else wanted, had the needs. And they said yes. So while they were making the movie, there was a brothel operating just, you could walk to it. In his old age, after he was retired, Ford said, "I should really write about the making of the Iron Horse," but he never did. In his papers, there's absolutely, he never committed anything to paper about it. He was shooting blind, by which I mean he didn't see rushes. He would shoot the scenes, they would be shipped to California. A week later, the rushes would come back. They had a projection room set up in one of the boxcars in the train where everybody was staying. But it was so cold that nobody wanted to sit for a couple hours and watch rushes. So for the most part, he never saw any of the footage he was shooting. He was going blind, but he was in his element, as he always would be on location. Ford was already bedeviled. by the alcoholism that would deface his life. Not his work particularly, but it would really be a problem in his life. He rarely drank during a picture. It only happened 2 or 3 times in a 50-year career. Between pictures was the danger zone. When he wasn't working was when he would fall off the wagon. His method of maintaining his sobriety, of self-medicating himself, was work. As long as he was working, he could stay sober because he couldn't direct drunk. Obviously, you have to be absolutely on point and answering a million questions from the crew. So you've got to be totally focused. This picture was one of the few times where he did fall off the wagon. Charlie Chaplin was shooting the Gold Rush in Truckee. At the same time, Ford was shooting the Iron Horse in Dodge, Nevada. So they had a Saturday, Sunday off. So Ford went up to Truckee, where he ransacked Raleigh Totherell, Chaplin's cameraman. He ransacked Raleigh Totherell's a cabin looking for some bootleg hooch, and he found some. And drank it and passed out and was basically non-compost metis for Sunday. But he got himself together and got back to Dodge on Monday to continue the shoot. He was supposed to have 4 weeks of location work. Well, 4 weeks came and went, and they were nowhere near getting stuff done. 6 weeks came and went, and the studios, what's going on? You got a runaway production going on. So Saul Wurtzel, who was associate producer, came out and took a look and thought everything was going well. So he went back to California. They were on location for almost double the 4 weeks before they came back to Hollywood for the interiors. On location, Ford was in his element because his way, as I said, his way of self-medicating himself was to make the movie. And away from the pressures of the studio, away from guys in suits telling him how to make the movie, in complete charge of the actual physical production of the picture, with 100 people looking up to him for answers to all their questions, for direction. He was the papa of this group, and that was Ford in his element. And it was a setting that he would replicate for the rest of his career, most specifically in Monument Valley, during Stagecoach and the westerns he made after Stagecoach, all in Monument Valley. Mostly with John Wayne, some with Henry Fonda. That was Ford's way of maintaining absolute control. And it worked, because in those environments where he was away from the pressures that would drive, internal and external, that would drive him to the bottle, he was at his best, at his most authoritative, at his most focused, writing with a camera, creating epic narrative with a camera. And this is the beginning of, as I said, Ford's responsibility for his own talent, because it's the beginning of his vision of America, which he would add to incrementally, picture by picture, for the next quarter century, 30 years. It was, as you'll see in the picture, it is, with the exception of Lincoln, America is not made by presidents or politicians. Ford worshipped Lincoln. It's made by shanty Irish and Chinese laborers and prostitutes and gamblers and disreputable people of all stripes. Those are the people that Ford, that had Ford's loyalty and passion and love, and those are the people that he put on the screen for all those years, culminating tomorrow in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, his last, not just his last great Western, it's his last great picture. I'll be around afterwards to talk about the picture and to sign books if any of you would like to buy them. Again, I thank you for your kind attention and for your willingness to come on out. And please welcome the accompanist for John Ford's Iron Horse, Mr. Andrew Simpson.